Lesson 7, Maintaining Biodiversity. In this lesson, we'll be looking at the science and engineering practices of planning and carrying out investigations, constructing explanations and designing solutions, engaging in an argument from evidence, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. We'll also be looking at the cross-cutting concepts of patterns, cause and effect, structure and function, and stability and change. As a reminder, biodiversity is the variety of different species of living things in a particular habitat or ecosystem. We are going to look into conservation and conservation efforts in this lesson as we talk about maintaining biodiversity. Conservation is the action of protecting a species, habitat, or ecosystem to prevent its decline or extinction. There are thousands of conservation programs across our country and across the world. Although programs may vary in their target species or ecosystems, all aim to maintain or improve biodiversity. As a result, conservation has an important role in reversing or reducing the negative effect of human activities on biodiversity. There are a number of different reasons for conservation. Those reasons include ensuring that there will be enough food and natural resources for future generations despite population increases. It's important for us to maintain natural cycles or nutrient cycles on our planet, as well as ecosystem stability. Conservation also helps by preventing species from becoming extinct. And there's also cultural and social reasons in which to practice conservation. For example, people enjoy forests or natural areas where they hike or recreate. It's also important to understand that conservation will allow us to preserve plant species in the event that those species are found to later on contain medicinal products. So how have we gone about protecting biodiversity? Actions to protect biodiversity are taken at many different levels in human societies. Governments make laws to protect parts of the environment against damaging human activities. Governments sometimes work together internationally as they develop these laws. Nonprofit organizations also work to protect or advance a particular cause. We think about different types of conservation programs like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Whitetails Unlimited, Trout Unlimited. There's a number of different conservation organizations in our local community. Communities run projects that protect the environment in their local area as well. Think of community work groups that do river or stream cleanups or roadside cleanups. And we as individuals can take our own actions to help protect biodiversity. Protected areas. Many countries have protected areas in which some human activities are restricted for conservation purposes. Protected areas are established by governments and protected by national laws. The U.S. has over 25,000 protected areas on land, amounting to 14% of our total land area. The level of protection in these areas varies widely. Some areas allow more human activity than others. We also have strict nature reserves. Some of these protected areas are managed in a very strict manner. These areas are created and managed to preserve ecosystems in their natural state. Human activities are strictly regulated, and many types of activities are forbidden. There are some locations where hiking is the only thing that is allowed. Other activities allow things like fishing and hunting. There are over 750 strict nature reserves in our country today. Our national parks. National parks are protected land areas in which human activities are regulated in order to protect the natural landscape. National parks allow more human activities than strict nature reserves do. Oftentimes, tourism is really popular in these areas. Some national parks allow other commercial activities like farming and mining. However, there are very strict processes and permitting that allows for this to happen. Yellowstone National Park is considered to be the oldest national park in the world. The United States kind of set the framework for creating national park areas. So what's the impact of protected areas? Why do we have them? Why are they important? By restricting activities that would alter or damage ecosystems, protected areas help to conserve biodiversity. Creating protected areas is not enough to protect biodiversity, however. We also must be carefully managing for biodiversity to thrive. That means oftentimes removal of invasive species and the addition of native species. Not only do we have land-based protected areas, we also have sea or ocean-based protected areas. Marine protected areas are areas of the Earth's seas that are protected against some human activities. The U.S. has 787 marine protected areas, amounting to about 12% of the country's marine area. Like protected areas on land, the level of protection given by MPAs is variable. Some of these areas are managed as strict nature reserves, whereas others allow commercial activities such as fishing and oil or gas extraction. So what's the impact of MPAs? Protection for the Earth's seas is recent. We have not done a very good job of protection of our oceans until very recently. The large majority of marine protected areas have been established within the past 20 years. Since their creation, they have been well studied to understand their impact on biodiversity. MPAs with strict protections that have been effectively enforced show significant improvements in biodiversity. They have more species in larger numbers and larger sizes than the same area before protection. Coral reefs. Many places with high biodiversity are not in protected areas. Coral reefs are areas of high biodiversity. They contain 25% of the world's marine species, but make up less than 0.25% of marine habitats. Coral reefs face a variety of threats from humans, including damage from fishing practices, overfishing, pollution, and climate change. As CO2 levels in our oceans increase, it can cause what's called coral bleaching, where the coral actually dies, and dead coral does not produce the same biodiversity as what living coral does. Around 18% of coral reefs are in protected areas. Less than 0.01% of coral reefs are in an area with strict protections, however. So what's the role of science here when we're talking about the maintaining of biodiversity? The study of ecosystems and the impact of human activities has improved our understanding of how biodiversity can be affected. By monitoring biodiversity, scientists can also determine the effectiveness of measures taken to protect it. Scientists' findings can be used by governments, organizations, and individuals to inform future generations. So here's a study example, and specifically we're looking at an indicator species. In the image, we're looking at a lichen. Lichens are useful indicator species as their distribution is affected by levels of nitrogen oxide pollutants. Fewer nitrogen oxide sensitive lichen are found in areas where there is a high level of nitrogen oxide pollution. This allows lichen to be used as an indicator of air quality. The pollution does not directly cause an increase in nitrogen oxide tolerant lichen. However, a decrease in the population of nitrogen oxide sensitive lichen provides space for the growth of the tolerant lichen. So an indicator species is a species that can provide information about the quality of a habitat or health of an ecosystem, very similar to what we just learned about with lichen. Some species are very sensitive to changes in their environment. This makes them good indicator species. Monitoring populations of indicator species can provide information about how ecosystems are being affected by human activities. This information can be used to help inform changes that minimize the impact of human activities. There are a whole host of indicator species throughout the planet, and by looking at those indicator species, we can have a better understanding of what human impacts are causing changes to the environment and negatively impacting biodiversity or indicator species as a whole. So looking at indicator species that we might be familiar with, in the past we've done some work on local streams. And so how do we survey for aquatic indicator species? To collect data on indicator species in a stream, scientists carry out a survey. This must be done carefully to ensure the data is accurate. Stage 1. The number and locations of the sampling stations are chosen. They must be spaced out where conditions suit the species, and it's also safe to access. In stage 2, before surveying, a risk assessment must be carried out. Riverbanks should be checked to make sure they are not weak or slippery, and buoyancy aids may be used in the process of conducting surveys. Stage 3. There may also be biological hazards. For example, Weil's disease, which is found in rat urine, can be contracted from river water. Researchers should wash their hands after sampling and take proper safety protocols. Stage 4. At the sample station, a deep tray is filled with water from the river. This will keep the sampled organisms alive while they are identified and counted. And in stage 5, a net is used to collect organisms from the river. The technique and equipment must be the same at each site so that the results can be compared. Changing the type of net and/or its size would allow for an unfair comparison. We must ensure that all of our practices remain consistent between the different sites. In stage 6, the invertebrates are identified using a key and their numbers are recorded. The data is now ready for analysis. So as we are interpreting results, we're going to look at how do populations of different organisms indicate the levels of pollution. And so if we were looking at a data table that looked similar to this, or a graph that looked similar to this, we have a distance from a sewage source, we have oxygen levels, and as we're closer to that sewage source, those oxygen levels are dropping off very drastically. But as we make our way away from that sewage source, the oxygen levels increase. So if we're looking at the distance down a stream, we might be looking at sample site number 1, sample site number 2, sample site number 3, and sample site number 4. As data is collected, we might see something similar to this. We may end up having higher samples of specific species of invertebrates dependent upon the location. So for example, closer to the sewage treatment area, we may have a large amount of sludge worm and rat-tailed maggots. A little bit further away, a larger population of bloodworms. A little bit further away, a larger population of freshwater shrimp. And then as our oxygen levels increase, we may see larger populations of stonefly nymphs. Sludge worm and rat-tailed maggots, these species can survive in an environment that is depleted of oxygen and are therefore an indicator of a high level of organic pollution. The maggot has a long breathing tube through which it can obtain air from above the water level. Bloodworms. A bloodworm can survive in a low oxygen environment as well. A large population of bloodworms indicates a moderate level of organic pollution. The worm contains hemoglobin, which helps it to extract oxygen when the levels are very low in the environment. Freshwater shrimp. Freshwater shrimp can thrive in areas with moderate oxygen concentrations. Its presence indicates an environment with a low level of organic pollution. Although the freshwater shrimp prefers water with high levels of oxygen, it can tolerate lower levels of pollution. And finally, the stonefly nymph. It only survives in environments with plenty of oxygen. Large populations of these organisms indicate that there is no organic pollution present. These animals have delicate gills with which to acquire oxygen from well-aerated waters, and they are often known as a clean water species. So if we're going back to our graph, we are noticing that there are specific species that arise or indicate the overall water quality in a specific area, whereas other species will only thrive when there is low pollution and high oxygen. There's a number of other indicator species in streams and rivers, like trout. These species are very sensitive to oxygen as well as pH levels. So think back to when we did our salmon reports and consider the data that we had collected. We ultimately could write an entire report specifically on the indicator species in the stream habitat and really just focus our attention there. So what action is taken against pollution? Pollution reduces biodiversity. And so I think it's important for us to consider action against it. Measures that reduce pollution exist at many levels. including incentives and laws from governments, actions of businesses and nonprofit organizations, and responsible choices by individuals. For example, international targets for reducing specific pollutions do exist. Fines for individuals and businesses causing pollution, cleanup projects, and reducing, reusing, and recycling. One of the current discussions that we have is about the idea of reducing plastic pollution. Seems like every time you sit down and you get looking at the news, there's some type of conversation pertaining to plastic pollution. It is a current threat to biodiversity for many of Earth's ecosystems. So what measures do we think that we can take in order to minimize the impact of plastics? And then why do we think plastics have an impact on biodiversity? Some companies have started to use biodegradable plastics, and these plastics oftentimes are able to be broken down by bacteria. The problem with this is that bacteria need specific conditions, such as certain temperatures and oxygen levels, in order to break down that plastic. So if these conditions are not met, the packaging will not be biodegradable. Many countries have taken steps to limit their use of single-use plastic bags. Some countries have banned these altogether, whereas others are looking to impose some form of change. Other examples may include recycling, community-based cleanup projects, and biodegradable or compostable plastics. Biodegradable plastics that pollute ocean environments may not break down as intended. Very similar to what we just got done talking about with temperatures and oxygen levels having to be at a specific level in order to get bacteria to break them down. Oftentimes, these plastics are only designed for breakdown in a terrestrial environment. All right, so let's look at engaging in argument from evidence. Which of these opinions do you agree with? This individual says, I don't know what all the fuss is about packaging for. It is much easier for me to do my food shopping if things are already packaged up. Besides, some delicate items need lots of packaging or else they get damaged. And then that would be a waste of a resource. If not, like, I'm responsible, I recycle as much plastic packaging as I can. This individual says, I work at a landfill site, and I don't think biodegradable packaging is the answer. It can take a long time to decompose if it's buried, as it needs oxygen to do so. It's better to burn waste so it doesn't build up. Recycling is a nuisance. I have 5 different bins. Where am I supposed to put them all? I'm sure a lot of energy gets used transporting materials like packaging around to be recycled and turning them into new products. Companies should focus on cutting down on the packaging instead. And finally, our last individual, I think there should be a law passed making companies use biodegradable packaging where possible. This would get rid of the problem of landfill sites becoming filled up with packaging. So we've got 4 individuals with differing opinions. Whom do you agree with most? Endangered species. Endangered species are those with such a low population size that they're at risk of extinction. So what effect does extinction have on biodiversity? Measures that help endangered species include protecting the habitats where the species lives, creating banks of seeds from endangered plants, educating people about protecting the species, as well as breeding animals in captivity. And we are going to explore many of these. Breeding programs. Breeding programs involve humans planning and encouraging species to reproduce, either in the wild or in captivity. Their aim is to increase population sizes in an attempt to protect endangered species from extinction. Some species only exist today because of breeding programs. In 1987, for example, there were just 217 California condors, as seen in the picture to the right. As a result, from breeding programs, there were 435 in 2015, 268 of which were living in the wild at the time. We also have captive breeding programs. Captive breeding is carried out in environments controlled by humans, such as wildlife reserves or zoos. Some animals raised in captivity are later released into the wild. However, this is not always a successful practice. Oftentimes, animals have not developed their behavioral skills, such as hunting, in order to survive without human help. As a result, the animals often have to remain in zoos or reserves for the rest of their lives. Captive breeding programs have been aimed at animals such as giant pandas, cheetahs, and the land snail. Problems with captive breeding programs. If very few animals are involved in a captive breeding program, it can lead to interbreeding or inbreeding. This is when closely related animals reproduce. It causes a gene pool to become extremely small. It can increase the susceptibility to disease of a specific species of organisms, and it can also reduce life expectancy. Zoos and nature reserves often exchange breeding animals. This reduces the likelihood of related individuals breeding with one another. Another problem is reproduction rate when we're talking about captive breeding organisms. Oftentimes, the reproduction rate of captive animals is lower than that of wild animals. This can be due to behavioral changes that occur when an animal is kept outside of its natural habitat. Sometimes captive animals show increased aggression, which makes them less likely to breed successfully. Some zoos end up using artificial breeding techniques in order to get those organisms to reproduce. Ecotourism. Ecotourism is a type of tourism that focuses on the natural environment and usually will support conservation projects and sustainable development. Its aim is to enable local people to benefit economically from their natural surroundings, all the while maintaining or even improving the area's biodiversity. Costa Rica is one such example. Costa Rica has a huge ecotourism industry. It attracts tourists who come to see some of the 500,000 different species that live in that area. As a result of the industry's growth, 23% of the country's land area is involved in protected area projects. Reforestation. Reforestation is the replacement of trees in a forest habitat following deforestation. Reforestation projects are one way of restoring biodiversity to a previously forested area. It is important that native tree species are used, as they are most likely to support the other species in the area. Recall that native species are ones that originally lived in that environment. This requires careful planning, as tropical forests contain thousands of different types of trees, each with a role in supporting the survival of other species. So how might biodiversity be affected if only one tree species was used for reforestation? A mixture of tree species is often needed for a reforestation project to succeed in increasing an area's biodiversity. If only one tree species is used, the new forest will be unable to support as many different species as if several tree species had been planted. This is because different species rely on different types of trees for resources such as food and shelter. Other methods of conserving forests. Where logging continues, reduced impact logging methods may be used. These techniques allow specific trees to be cut down while minimizing damage to surrounding trees. People living in forests are encouraged to manage forest land sustainably through community projects. Products such as cocoa beans and timber grown sustainably can be given a special stamp which enables them to be sold at a higher price. This allows people to make a living while protecting biodiversity. And it's important for us as the consumer to seek out those specific products in order for this conservation practice to be encouraged. If we're not buying these products, then the conservation practice is not sustainable. Conservation issues. Can you think of any problems that conservation projects may encounter? Projects often involve cooperation between conservation organizations, commercial businesses, and local people. As a result, it can take a long time for everyone to reach an agreement on what a particular scheme will involve. Once a project is started, it can be difficult to evaluate whether it's successful. And so continual monitoring is extremely important. It is often a requirement to make sure that the scheme or project is having a positive effect on biodiversity. Sometimes there are conflicts. Conservation projects can cause conflicts with businesses and people who have other interests. For example, farming and fishing. There may be conflicts with individuals that are making money off of farming and fishing because conservation programs may take up space that is used for those practices. There may also be conflicts with construction and fossil fuel extraction. Where businesses are making money, oftentimes they are resistant to engage in conservation projects. These people are relying on making use of land and its resources for their livelihood. Conservation projects can put restrictions on their businesses. And so take a little bit of time as we wrap up. Can you suggest why a commercial fishing business might come into conflict with a conservation project? And consider, how might you go about minimizing those conflicts and get the fishermen or the commercial fishing industry to also have buy-in? Because ultimately it's really important that they have fish to catch in order to continue making their living into the future.